The woman was kicked out of the restaurant, but what the young man did next shocked everyone. A winter afternoon in New York, the icy chill enveloped every street. Inside a small diner, people were enjoying warm meals. The diner wasn't large, but it was cozy enough to offer comfort amidst the freezing weather. Inside the diner, a middle-aged woman stepped in. Her name was Lily. She wore a worn-out coat, her eyes reflecting exhaustion and worry. She approached the counter and hesitantly asked the server, "Excuse me, may I buy a bowl of hot soup?" The server looked her up and down before coldly replying, "We don't serve people like you here. Please leave." Lily lowered her head, her eyes filled with shame and sadness. She turned to leave, but a voice called out from behind, "Wait!" Everyone in the diner turned to look. Ethan, a young man about 25 years old, stood up from his table. He wore a thick coat, his face radiating determination, and what he did next left everyone speechless. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're from in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We upload new videos every day at 12:30 p.m. Mrs. Lily is a lonely woman who lives quietly in a small house, relying on her modest pension to make ends meet. However, her heart is always full of kindness. Every day she spends time at the church doing volunteer work, sweeping, picking up trash, and taking care of every little corner, even though she receives no salary for it. Her husband passed away when she was only 20, leaving her to raise their only daughter on her own. Now her daughter is married and lives far away. Each year she can only visit her mother once. For Mrs. Lily, those are the happiest days of the year. Every time her daughter and grandchildren come home, she busily prepares her daughter's favorite soup, a dish filled with love that she carefully cooks with the freshest ingredients. That day, Mrs. Lily was eagerly awaiting her daughter's visit, but a phone call from a public telephone booth shattered that anticipation. On the other end of the line, her daughter's voice trembled as she apologized for having to postpone the trip. Her husband and son had suddenly fallen ill, so she wouldn't be able to come home as promised. After hanging up, Mrs. Lily stepped out onto the street with a heavy heart. Sadness crept into every step she took, making the familiar road suddenly feel more distant and emptier than ever before. Without realizing when it happened, her feet had brought her to the door of a restaurant. Like a habit, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, hoping to find a little warmth amid the chaos of life. Witnessing the outrageous behavior of the server, Ethan spoke up. "Wait a minute." The entire restaurant fell silent, and all eyes turned to Ethan. His face was sharp, and his eyes gleamed with determination. "She didn't do anything wrong. Why are you kicking her out?" Ethan asked, his voice warm yet firm. The staff member replied nervously, "She doesn't look like a customer. We have the right to refuse service." Ethan stepped up to the counter, his gaze unwavering. "Is that so? I believe everyone has the right to be treated fairly. If she can't afford to pay, I'll pay for her." The whole restaurant buzzed with whispers. The staff member stood there, at a loss for words. Ethan turned to Mrs. Lily and smiled. "What would you like?" "Go ahead, choose anything. I'll pay." Mrs. Lily was surprised, her eyes welling up with tears. She softly said, "A hot bowl of soup, please." Ethan nodded and turned back to the counter. "One hot bowl of soup and a side of bread as well. I'll pay for it." After receiving the bowl of soup and the side of bread, Mrs. Lily found a quiet corner near the window to sit. Her thin hands trembled as she held the spoon, but each small sip seemed to warm her heart, which had grown so cold over time. Ethan, sitting from afar, couldn't take his eyes off her. She seemed like the very embodiment of loneliness, a woman who had borne all the pain life could throw at her. He decided to stand up and walk over to her table. Pulling out a chair, he sat down and spoke gently. "Sorry, I don't mean to disturb you, but are you all right?" Hearing the gentle voice, Mrs. Lily looked up at him. In her dull eyes, a faint but deeply emotional glimmer shone. She put down her spoon and softly said, "You're very kind. I don't know how to thank you. I thought I wouldn't make it through today." Ethan listened in silence, not interrupting her. Mrs. Lily shared, "I once had a happy family. My husband was a kind man, and we had a beautiful daughter, but he passed away in an accident when she was still young. I worked tirelessly to raise her, But when she grew up, she married and moved far away. Since then, I've lived alone. She's busy with her own family, so she only visits me once a year. They spent several hours driving to the city. When the car finally stopped in front of her daughter's small house, Mrs. Lilly hesitated, unsure if she could step out. Ethan smiled and said, "You've been waiting for this day for a long time. Let your daughter have the chance to hold you in her arms." The door opened and a young woman stepped out. Upon seeing her mother, she froze in shock, then burst into tears and ran to embrace Mrs. Lilly. The mother and daughter cried in the joy of their reunion, while Ethan quietly stepped back, giving them space. Ethan's help not only brought a warm meal, but also completely changed Mrs. Lilly's life. After learning what had happened, her daughter decided to bring her mother to live with her family. She apologized for being so busy that she had neglected her elderly mother back home. Ethan became a close friend of Mrs. Lilly's family. He often visited and shared happy moments with them. The small restaurant where everything had begun also became a symbol of kindness. The story of Ethan and Mrs. Lilly spread everywhere, inspiring a spirit of mutual support and compassion within the community. Mrs. Lilly, once a lonely woman, now lives surrounded by the love and care of her family. She knew that even a small act of kindness from a stranger could change a life completely. And Ethan, not only had he helped Mrs. Lilly, but he also found joy and meaning in spreading goodness. He became an inspiration, reminding everyone that, with just a little kindness, you can create a miracle.